Field of view, the term that defines exactly how much you can see and an aspect often neglected in virtual reality. Most of the truly wide FOV headsets were released quite a ways back and are pretty old now, like say the Pimax AKX, which claimed 200 diagonal field of view and reached 160 horizontal. Numbers still unmatched to this day on the consumer market, where 100 to 110 is around what most are getting. But with its age, its fidelity is more than last generation on both raw visual quality of the screens and the optics themselves. The through the lens speaks for itself with how blurry aspects of it are. But this is where the Pimax Crystal Super's ultra-wide module, what we'll be looking at today, comes in, which claims an undistorted 140 degrees field of view while providing extremely high clarity up there with current high-end options of the market. And yes, this does not quite match the AKX horizontally, but it would still match the normal FOV mode that headset had of 140 and would be noticeably wider than Pimax's 50 ppd module, which is just a bit shy of 130. And itself is significantly wider than something like the average Quest 3 reaches a little under 110, which sounds all well and good, as long as the headset can deliver that field of view, right? So, let's get some important disclaimers out of the way, because there is some key stuff beyond just standard reviewer things. Firstly, yes, the module was sent to me for free and for review purposes by Pimax. Go look at my 57 ppd review if you think that's gonna make me soft on it, though. Secondly, and this is very important, the situation concerning the ultrawide's distortion profile, it's been kind of a complete disaster where the rendered FOV and visuals have changed at least 3 times in the past few months, despite being a shipping product that was allegedly, but not really, finished. Because of this, if you do see my experiences and numbers with the ultra-wide module are noticeably different to other reviewers, well, it's probably because they were likely on an entirely different distortion profile. I've seen values of 134 degrees with 90 overlap, 138 with 84, and then the recent 138 with 88 overlap, which was only available to external beta tests starting early December. So any reviewer before that point, they're probably going to be out of date. Not the reviewer's fault. Blame Pimax. I am going to be reviewing this on the most recent distortion profile reflecting the product that you would get today if you ordered, because from talking to Pimax, it sounds like they're going to be using this one as the foundation and continuing, and might try to make some further tweaks here and there. So I don't think there will be any major changes, hopefully. But if you are watching this in the far future and something has changed, I will try to remember to have a pinned comment down below specifying if anything here is out of date. I do have a lot to say about that whole thing with the complete embarrassment that was the company's behavior in releasing a product in the state it is, but for those who are not interested in that and just want the product as it is today, I'm going to be putting that at the end, right before the conclusions, so those who don't care about that can just easily skip over it. But you should care, as it relates to the faith you should put in the product for support going forward. Now, thirdly, I'm just going to be focusing on the module itself, as is really just like a bigger 50 ppd with a few compromises to get that field of view. Uses the same lenses and panels. If you want a more in-depth look at all of those aspects, I have an extensive review of that module from a little bit back. Visuals will still be covered in brief though. If you don't want to watch another video, just nothing super thorough, because there are some differences and downsides here. Alrighty then, let's get to the big selling point of this headset. The field of view. Here are the HMDQ values. These are what the headset itself physically kind of renders and can be seen as a theoretical maximum. And these numbers, they're kind of nutty. About matching what Pimax's claims, since we're hitting 138 horizontal and 88 overlap versus their 140 and 190 claims. It's basically just rounding up by like 1.5 degrees, which a lot of the industry does, unfortunately. Some more so, like with the Vive Pro 2's 120 claim. So this is just overall great to see. But these numbers are just a theoretical maximum. Let's check out some actual values of what I see with my subjective WIM-FOV results. This can sometimes measure a degree or two past the rendered. These, thankfully, do line up. 140 horizontal and 111 vertical it's truly a crazy combination. If I compare it to my 50 ppd results, we essentially traded 2 degrees of vertical vertical to get 4 to 11 degrees of horizontal, depending on the axis. This is a lot more noticeable than you might think because the overall area of the field of view is increasing and it's not just like a straight line in one direction. I'm big on vertical FOV, but it's barely a sacrifice for a noticeable gain everywhere else. Totally worth it, unlike some of the earlier profiles which noticeably drop vertical. However, what's not a small sacrifice is the stereo overlap. What stereo overlap is the area both eyes see, and this is a key factor, but not the only one, of that 3D effect which gives VR a sense of depth. The 50 ppd module has a truly incredible stereo overlap. I measured 106 degrees, and you can see it. It's all very circular, whereas the Ultrawide only gets about 90. Pimax themselves has said the way they got wider FOV without sacrificing visuals was reducing that overlap. So this makes sense, expected results. But 90 is still fairly good overlap. That's quite above average. You may notice the stereo overlap percent is very low and think I'm crazy calling this good because we went from 77.4% to 64.5%. But I don't agree with using overlap percent as a sole metric and think it is a little misleading. Unless you are comparing to similar FOV headsets, since it basically punishes bigger FOV and doesn't paint the full picture either. I'm more fond of degrees because if I pull up and compare the much smaller field of view Quest 3 to the Ultrawide, the Quest 3's overlap percentage is noticeably higher because of how much smaller the field of view is. But if you look at degrees, literally every single axis of the Ultrawide has bigger numbers. Going straight horizontal, you have 82 on the Quest 3 versus 90 here. And let me tell you, the Quest 3's overlap feels terrible in comparison to this. That's why I think percent alone is a poor metric. And just to very briefly touch on it, the 50 ppd does have a lab mode, which technically has slightly higher FOV, but it comes with noticeably more distortions. I have to set the IPD wider, and after about an hour and a half to 2 hours, some eye strain noticeably begins setting in for me. And while some people can use it, most impressions I have seen have been quite negative on it, even calling it quite unusable. So I would not recommend it to most people. But if you have the 50 ppd and this mode works for you, well, great. No need for the Ultrawide. This all said, 140 and 111 vertical feels awesome. Everyone likely knows that sense of blinders you get from VR headsets with all the blackness in your peripheral. Now, this is still quite a far cry from human vision, which can reach around 200 to 220, not even counting eye movement, at least from what I've seen. So, black bars, they aren't all gone. However, with the 50 ppd, I think they were beginning to feel like they were kind of going away, whereas on the Ultrawide, that sense is even greater, and I'm not going to say they're all gone, especially as I have used wider like the 8KX, but it's really impressive how often I don't feel like the black bars are obstructive in this thing. It's a lot less like having such a high quality window into the virtual field, and more like being in it instead, because I just have more stuff around me instead of blackness. And that is because field of view is a huge thing for me. I think it's highly undervalued in VR. But one thing let's address quickly, you may be wondering, well, why was there 119 rendered vertically? I'm only getting 111 here. Is Pimax just being extremely inefficient with their distortion profile, or would a better face shape get more? The answer is probably, at least, no to both of those. I normally do like covering technical stuff, but this review got a lot longer than expected for just a module, so I'm going to make this a little brief. But the Super uses canted displays versus parallel ones, which that can cause issue in some games that don't account for it. So one way for the headset to get around this is a brute force method of over-rendering, and this can result in some inflated vertical values. If you wish to read the much more in-depth explanation, I will be linking a good article by the HMDQ creator, Risa 2000, down in the description about parallel projections. I don't want to just read word for word and steal all their stuff. But the point is, if you get all the FOV, this is great. Emphasis, if. Because, while my results may have been great, I cannot guarantee you'll get those results, as I've seen a number of strange ones which I don't think are just easily dismissed as, oh, you just have an unlucky poor face shape, go back and play the genetic lottery again. I've seen several cases of people who've gotten less sometimes noticeably so, FOV on the ultrawide than the 50 ppd module. It makes no sense to me, as these lenses are about identical and just slightly change in the orientation. One of those people even confirmed a extremely bizarre software bug where they only got the expected FOV on the ultrawide if they swap modules to the 50 ppd, then back to the ultrawide. I will say, I've seen more results with expected values in the 130 to 140 range than I have with crazy results like that. And to an extent, despite what I just said, some people really may have just been unlucky on their face shape and not getting a full field of view. But the fact I found even one confirmed case of this makes me wonder how many else could be out there and if it's happening with some of the others. I can only speak for my own results, really, which are great, but at the time of this writing, Pimax hasn't identified what could potentially be the cause of this. I think they're trying, though, as they mentioned a little bit back about reaching out to them if you're getting less than 130 degrees, which makes recommend buying the standalone module not really a good prospect because they have no return policy on these. This seems like it is a small minority, but enough to be very cautious when you remember that. But again, I just don't think we can sweep all the low FOV complaints as just a bug, since some people simply aren't getting good results, and I think that's because Pimax is really pushing a single element of spheric lens very hard. I don't think you're gonna need some super special magical face shape that virtually nobody has to get somewhere in the mid-30s. But getting the full field of view on this, it just seems really hard. All right, now let's talk about the actual visual experience, huh? Alongside the sweet spot, because the way you find it and how that impacts the visuals is very important. FOV's not so nice if there's a bunch of distortions and artifacts to it, right? See, if we compare this to the 50 ppd, despite using the same lenses, the sweet spot on this it's noticeably a lot more sensitive, particularly on the vertical axis. If you follow the eye tracking guide on where to put the headset, I think it actually has you put this thing up too high, because I did that and the distortions sucked. On the peripheral, they were actually decent, maybe even slightly better than the 50 ppd. But in the center, they were not good. Extremely obvious during quick head movement, very much an immersion breaking experience because unlike slight peripheral distortion on such wide field of view, this slaps you in the face constantly where the image should be at its best. And I hated it versus the 50 ppd's greater geometric stability. But while playing with the fit to fix this, I made an interesting discovery. See, if I wore the headset lower than the eye tracking suggested, very slightly, and also physically held the headset while tilting it forward, the distortions got a lot better. Like, ridiculously so. Where Pimax's claim of an undistorted 140 FOV almost makes sense. It wasn't completely fixed, but incredibly minor that I'd only barely notice it when rapidly moving my head. Close to the 50 ppd, really. But here's the problem. This may be a thing for my face shape, but getting the headset to naturally rest in this position while during active play, that was utterly impossible without basically $130 worth of comfort mods. Shout out to Studio Form Creative for all the things I have on here. I'm not sponsored, I just really like their stuff. And their comfort mods completely salvage this for me. Even after doing all of this, however, anytime I have to noticeably crane my neck upwards like this, the headset it slides just out of place enough to kind of bring him back a little. Now, this said, the vertical FOV, that's, to my knowledge, literally second best in the consumer industry, helps a hell of a lot with not needing to do that as much, since you can just look around with your eyes, and it slides back into place nicely when looking down. But aside from that one bit on distortions and one other thing, it's essentially just bigger 50 ppd. Local dimming's the same to give better black levels and contrast. Brightness is still among the best on the market, and a bright sunny day feels so much better than other headsets. Neara's gonna be panel variant somewhat, and mine's about the same as a 50 ppd, perhaps a little worse, and really on the edge of a grade 1 scale Pimax uses, but it does still fall under there. It's still there, and you will tend to see this on solid or bright colors, kind of like little lines. But as for that other thing I mentioned, it is the chromatic aberration getting worse. It's actually not so bad in the overlap area, outside some of the worst cases like UI elements, but thankfully, those aren't going to be around too often in most games. But as you get further toward the peripheral, chromatic aberration gets much worse than the 50 ppd. It actually creates sort of a weird effect on some elements because these lenses actually have super impressive sharpness and keep things in focus throughout most of the view. But this actual CA becomes so intense on the far peripheral that for fine elements like, say, text, to use this segment of my script as an example, it's like things get a double, maybe even triple image when you get to the furthest edges. I can actually still read the text of my script well, even when it is almost all the way in my peripheral, but at times I feel that legibility is impaired more so by the chromatic aberration getting so intense rather than the image actually getting out of focus, like on some lens designs. It's not the worst I have seen, 57 ppd still is, but if you've used the crystal line before and the CA has felt like a compromise at best to you, it's probably going to be too much for you to work with. Now, in some places it's better, like areas which don't have a bunch of tiny little details or have bigger geometry. But then there's environments where a bunch of finer aspects, like the cockpit of somewhere you want to read a bunch of things in, it hits really hard if it is outside that general center area. And even then, some UI elements they don't play nice with these optics where it's multicolored hell of everything having its own shadows. Most of the time, your eyes will be in that center, so it's not as bad as it could be, and I don't feel like it's so bad I don't ever want to look away from there. But I would say this is easily the biggest weakness of the lenses if you can actually get them dialed in. Now, performance-wise, well, I'm just going to let the on-screen resolution speak for itself. Yes, that is the real 1.0 resolution at a jaw-dropping 6812 by 6500 per eye. By comparison, it's got a bit over 10% higher res of the already absurd 50 ppd. If you would like a general idea of how well this performs, I do have a video which takes an in-depth look at the 5090 on that in a number of games, and I already showed that even that car is going to get its ass kicked. Once again, this all said, though, there's still a surprising number of games that you can run at 90 Hz with this resolution, or at least very close to it. If you can drive this at roughly medium res, which is 5108 by 4876, I still don't feel that you are wasting the headset. No amount of super sampling on something else will get you more FOV if that is your big thing, and also high brightness, no matter what res you're running at. But if you start to go significantly below that, the clarity, it really starts to take a noticeable hit. If you're not on a 4090, a 5080, or a 5090, and I really recommend that last card because it can double or more the performance of the 4090 at these kind of resolutions, just don't even bother with this unless FOV is one of your highest priorities in virtual reality. And even then, you're gonna have to be willing to sacrifice a lot of clarity below 5090. Even those cards, even the 5090, they're gonna get destroyed on the most demanding things trying to run them at full res, such as Sims or certain flat to VR mods. If you don't want to run this at lower resolution though, and still preserve some clarity, there is a narrow field of view mode which crops the horizontal and makes the full res 5012 by 6500 per eye, which is still an incredibly high amount, but it's actually not too wild for a 5090 to drive it, and this is still lower than the 50 ppd's full res. I could live with this in a few games if I had to. Still wouldn't buy it if you're intending to primarily use this though. I wish Pimax gave some more control over this or also allowed vertical cropping. Alright, let's have a very quick roundup of identical or near identical specs to the other modules so you don't have to watch the other videos. If you're wondering why the audio got so much worse, that is because audio-wise, this is the Crystal Super's microphone. It's serviceable. It's not really good. A bit lackluster on something which costs this much. Headphone audio-wise, though, the default S-Mass it comes with, they aren't too great. Little below Quest 2 or 3 audio. Nice the audio at least exists, though. The D-Mass, though, these are top-level VR audio, but they cost more money. And then there's the 2 USB-C ports on here. one at the bottom, which is the 3.0, and another one at the top right supporting 2.0. And that 2.0 port is what I'm using to run the mod mic USB right now that you are hearing again. So there are some room for attachments, but if you use the Lighthouse faceplate for base station tracking, that's going to take your bottom USB port. If you want to do social VR, stuff like Broken Eye works to get some advanced parameters on eye tracking as well, which is quite nice. This also weighs about the same as the other QLED modules. The micro OLED is definitely lighter, but comfort-wise, it's kind of tricky because I don't think you can easily wear this optimally without a bunch of comfort mods. Tracking-wise with these controllers, I've had it quite good and fine with minimal issues, contrary to what I've heard with some complaints. Aside from needing to reset my play space height each time, and aiming down the sights can be a little shaky, but I also have a top-end system that can kind of just brute force some issues, so if you got a lower-end CPU, you may have a bad time. I hear some mixed reports concerning the tracking, particularly on the controllers, but I just don't have an issue with it, at least on my 9950X3D. Alright, before we get to the conclusions, let's talk about the complete shit show of this launch, with Pimax shipping something that was blatantly broken or fell well short of the advertised specs that they only fixed after the fact. This is what I've been saving my rant for. So let's make a little bit of a timeline. This headset, since it started shipping, had at least 3 different distortion profiles. I received this back in mid-September, months ago, mind you, and the distortion profile on it had rendered values like this. It hit close to 140 horizontal, sure, but it resulted in a more notable decrease in your vertical field of view and several degrees less than their claimed 90 overlap. But this profile was a completely broken mess, with distortions and warping so bad I physically could not use it for longer than 30 minutes without getting so sick. The only time I ever got worse was the first time I used VR years ago. It was the definition of unusable, and I spoke to some other testers who had this profile that found it similarly bad. But then on the software version, right prior to that, the profile was again different. Not rendering the claimed 90 overlap, but only 134 horizontal, which that fell well short of the 140 claim now. But this profile was good. It's geometrically stable, not too bad chromatic aberration. In fact, it was basically identical to the 50 PPD. So identical, in fact, I question what's the point of this when you get, best case, like 6-7 degrees more horizontal for 15 overlap and losing a few vertical. I also think this was the profile that the earliest reviewers got because they measured results in the 136-ish range. But the problem is that regular customers were getting the headset shipped to them like this. Some got it with horribly distorted profile that was literally unusable. And Pimax then, after the feedback, went back to the smaller FOV one as a response, which again, you'd have a fine experience on, but there was legitimately no goddamn point to it versus the 50 PPD. And the big marketing point of 140 field of view just wasn't true for literally close to 3 months. Pimax was shipping this in a state of an unfinished profile they were actively trying to fix. The latest profile this review is based on did not go out till the first days of December for beta testing. And it wasn't in a public release, so normal customers who were not following this and to apply to the beta wouldn't have easy access. That only happened in the latest client, at the time of this writing, released December 24th. That's the one when the public branch anyone could get had it. Now, does the headset meet all the advertised points? Yes, 140 FOV. I don't really see much distortions, at least when worn in a very specific way. It's 90 overlap. It is meaningfully wider than 50 PPD, if you can actually get that field of view. And it has a point to exist. But this was not changes made during beta testing before it went to normal consumers. It's one thing to make improvements and changes to a product over time. That's good. Pimax does this a lot. But there are some core specs and major changes happening here. I've seen some people who actually preferred the bit smaller field of view profile because it had less chromatic aberration and a lower render resolution. Even if that profile then means Pimax blatantly lied about the field of view, and I bet most people bought it for that. But they can't use it now unless they stick to older versions, which may lack some key improvements to the software as time goes on. It's more than just like, oh, it's a couple degrees. What's the difference? Because the things like the distortions, the chromatic aberration, and all that, they do change. The CA on this is worse than the older profiles. I've seen it. It's like just, oh god damn it, just roll the Darth Vader clip again.
I am altering the deal. Pray I don't alter it any further.
That. It feels like that. For the third, fourth time. I don't even know at this point. It's tiring to keep track. Bought this for the current profile, which I like. And then Pimax reverted back to the earlier one with slightly but noticeably smaller field of view. I'd be pissed because these headsets, even as individual modules, are not cheap. And for many who got it early, they're well outside their return period. Or if they bought an individual module, there's no returns for this. And all those reviews of this before, say, mid-December, they immediately don't matter much. And if you are looking for other opinions to evaluate if you should buy this, well, at the time of this writing, I would say if the video is from earlier than mid-December, I'd probably discount the review just because the reviewer almost certainly is on a different distortion profile. No disrespect to any of them and the hard work they put into their videos, but it's just what they had at the time is not what you're gonna get. And the distortion profile is core to VR headsets. And Pimax has also told me that they're still working on the ultra-wide module, so give it another few months and this review could be dated too. Okay, editor's note here to prove my point, as I forgot about it with how long I put this off. And keep in mind everything I'm about to say also applies to the ultra-wide module because Pimax, when they announced it, directly called it a variant of the 50ppd using the exact same lenses and exact same panels. So yeah, things should be the same. When Pimax originally announced the Crystal Super, they claimed 200 nits of brightness in the Pimax Frontier event on April 15, 2024. Then, on the Pimax Sync event in November 21st, 2024, they cited 280 nits of brightness, which was then a consistently used figure in advertising for the 50 and 57 ppd showing up in multiple places, such as the Crystal Super update on February 20th and also advertising slides used in public for the 50 ppd's launch around April 4th. This same slide was even on Pimax's webpage to advertise the Crystal Super as late as July 13th, 2025, well after regular customers had started getting their orders and people paid for it. But then jump ahead to August 3rd, sometime between those two dates, Pimax silently changed the marketing to claim only 200 nits of brightness again, many months after it already shipped. I asked multiple times for comment, given how long this review took. But Pimax would not give me an answer, not even a no comment or decline to comment. I just got silence. And I hate to assume malice, but just given the pattern of behavior with things like lying about the OG Crystal's FOV, the 50 ppd's FOV, and now this, I really have to believe somebody knows the truth, but thinks the consumers just won't pay attention to all the changing specs bullshit and they can get away with it. But Pimax, you can't keep fucking doing this all the time, especially after people already paid money. This shit is false advertising. Instead of being impressed for what the headset is, I have to rant about what it isn't because you're the company who set certain expectations and then altered the deal so it's a disappointment just by comparison. Please, just stop with this constant shooting for the stars but only reaching the sky. This is why the company has the reputation it does when it doesn't have to be this way, when the headsets can stand on their own merits. But I struggle to believe anything will ever change because it's been the same song and dance nearly every single product launch. I'm so tired of doing this. Always got to be something, doesn't it? Okay. All right. Okay. Rant done. let's calm down and talk about some overall conclusions and value proposition now. Plain and simple, this is personally my favorite module out of all 4 out, yet I would recommend it to almost no one. The reason for this is because everything about it just kind of lives on the razor's edge of it being just good enough to not be a major problem for my personal taste. The chromatic aberration gets quite bad on the edges, but the FOV is so large and it being so far out in the peripheral, it's tolerable to me. It's just stable enough geometrically. The FOV is just big enough versus the 50 ppd to feel like a noticeable improvement. If any of those things were even a tiny bit worse, and I've seen how they get worse via the various distortion profiles, I prefer the 50 ppd. The compromises of this headset are just kind of the exact ones that I'm willing to make, but some people, they might not be willing to. But it also requires an absurdly precise fit that would have been literally impossible for me to work with without a bunch of extra comfort mods. Pimax is also seriously pushing the limits of a single element lens, as even when people have used the same profile as me, I rarely see them get the numbers close to mine. I have a particularly blessed face shape where I max out pretty much every headset I use, but the optical design here, it just seems like it struggles to fully deliver all that FOV unless you're like me. Most results I've seen of this are in the 130 to 136 range, which is good, but that's missing a noticeable amount still and not a huge improvement over the 50 ppd unless you're getting similarly lower margins on it. And if you're not getting the full FOV of this, it's hard to feel like a meaningful upgrade from the 50 ppd with how similar they are. As that module, it seems better about getting close to its max field of view from what I've seen. It's not pushing the limits as hard. However, if you do have the face shape to get the max field of view out of this, alongside the supercomputer to drive it, of course, oh man, the Ultrawide is something special. In that case, this is pretty much the upgrade to the 8KX from ye olden days. It's essentially that on normal mode, but it's even more vertical FOV and overlap with a huge increase on clarity. The fidelity and clarity on this, it's just fantastic. Not quite gonna match normal 4K size monitors, but it's into desktop sharpness, where the game tends to be the limiting factor a little more so than the headset, save the higher fidelity titles, of course. The headset really just has great overall specs in nearly everything but size and weight. The field of view is incredible, the stereo overlap is solid, clarity, it isn't the best on the market, but it's high-end. Contrast doesn't quite hit the highs of a good OLED setup, but it can come very close with the lack of glare on aspheric lenses. And considering the direction the industry's going towards much smaller form factors, which in turn gets lower field of view with those very tiny little panels. Well, I don't want to speak too strongly on things because it's a very fast-moving space. I don't see a whole lot coming out in the next 2, maybe 3 years, which would compete or dethrone this noticeably on field of view. Maybe there'll be like one specific release somewhere. But if you can tolerate the big size, I think the Ultrawide will hold up for a while if you're prioritizing high FOV and clarity. Because look at the 8KX and how many years it took for things to start getting into even the same zip code as that for FOV. If you're deciding between this or the 50 ppd module, since FOV is that important to you, honestly, I'd probably recommend the 50 ppd, despite the fact that I prefer this. Because the 50 ppd is just, it's much less finicky, and I think it's got a better chance of working well for most. If you already have the 50 ppd, are wondering though, well, is upgrading to the Ultrawide worth it? I have a very good face shape, yeah? I'd also say no to that, unless several $100s literally means nothing to you, and FOV is your number one thing in VR. There is an appreciable difference, if you can get it, but it's not enough to warrant that cost, in my opinion. If you already have an Ultrawide on order and you are dead set on it for field of view, if you don't mind tinkering or buying some comfort mods, I think it's worth trying because Pimax does have their 14-day return policy so you can get your money back, which they don't have on the individual modules. And if you do want to order it or another module, though, I will have an affiliate link down in the description for both the Super and the Studio Form Comfort mods that I use to make this work well. Do really get some more opinions than just mine, though, because there's a few things as sacrifices that not everyone's going to love, but given the change in distortion profiles, if a review is from before mid-December, it's probably got a different profile than what I've been reviewing here, and you may need to look for something a little more recent. Okay, there is the video. What did you think? Are you interested in the ultrawide? Did you have some very unfortunate luck with the field of view, or did you get really good numbers? Let me know down in the comments. If you enjoyed the video, consider sticking around to see what I do next. Otherwise, thanks for making it to the end anyway, and perhaps I will see you again sometime in the recommendeds. Later.